For this worksheet, we're going to take a look at a more complex food web. The first thing that we need to do is make sure that we understand the vocabulary being used. At the top of the paper, it asks you to label each organism as either a scavenger, a decomposer, a detritivore, an omnivore, a carnivore, a herbivore, or a primary producer. So first, let's go ahead and walk through defining these words again. A scavenger is an organism that looks around for dead food and carcasses that are left over from other predators that they have not finished eating or they have leftovers. Decomposers are going to be breaking down materials that are already dead. Detritivore is eating organic material that's already broken down. An omnivore is going to eat both plants and animals. A carnivore is only going to eat other consumers. A herbivore only eats producers. And a primary producer, those are always going to be the autotrophs that make their own food through the process of photosynthesis or cellular respiration. Take a minute, pause the video here, and see if you can fill in each of the boxes on the page. When you're ready, unpause the video to check your answers. Let's start at the top of this food web with the vulture. The reason that the vulture in this image has dotted lines going to it is because it is actually going to grab food that is left over from other organisms as they are consuming their prey. So, for example, here you can see the vulture is connected to the alligator right here. The vulture might not necessarily eat the alligator. The vulture is actually going to scavenge food off of what the vulture what the alligator leaves laying around. So we call the vulture a scavenger. So make sure in box number 1 that you have the word scavenger written down. As you move your way to the left, we have an anhinga and a largemouth bass. Both of these are going to be carnivores. If we follow the arrows that point to the anhinga, we can see that he eats a largemouth bass as well as a killifish, the crawfish in the Everglades, and the pig frog. So all of these are other consumers, so that makes him a carnivore. Make sure in box number 2 you have the word carnivore written down. Now, for the largemouth bass, if we follow all of the arrows for the largemouth bass, we can see that he eats the flagfish as well as the grass shrimp and worms and the killifish, which means that he's eating all consumers as well. He's not eating any plants, so that makes him a carnivore as well. As you move down the left to the flagfish, you'll see that there's only one arrow pointing to the flagfish, and that comes from the algae. So that means that the flagfish is what we call a herbivore. Herbivores only eat plants, and since the only thing that is pointing to the flagfish is the algae, that makes him a herbivore. So again, making sure that you have an understanding of vocabulary is going to be key in being able to label what kind of food feeding role these organisms have in your food web. As we move down to number 5, algae is going to be a primary producer. They are going to be making their food through the process of photosynthesis. As we move over to number 6 on the diagram, we get to the detritivore. The detritivore is the one that eats materials that are already decaying, such as what is called detritus. So the way to know that number 6, which is going to be your grass, shrimp, and your worms, are detritivores, is if we follow the arrow for what they eat. The grass, shrimp, and worms are going to eat things such as detritus and bacteria. As we move over to number 7 in the diagram, notice how for the detritus and bacteria and fungi in this image, there are dotted lines pointing to them for what they eat. That's because as decomposers, they're actually eating a lot more than what these two arrows point to, because they are going to be working to break down material into simpler compounds, and so that's why they're called decomposers. So they actually eat more than really what these dotted arrows are pointing to them for. And you might want to make yourself a note below it that they are breaking down dead organisms. Really, because they are decomposers, you would actually point every single organism to them, but in a food web we don't do that. They're very important to a food web to break down and help with recycling, but that's why we do things like just put in dotted lines, and there's kind of a understanding that decomposers are connected to all the organisms in this food web and pretty much any food web, because they're going to be breaking down anything as it dies. As we move over to the right side of the page, number 10, the plant's leaves and seeds and fruits, those are going to be primary producers. Again, those are all photosynthetic organisms. And as we follow the arrow up towards the raccoon and towards the white-tailed deer. Number 9 is actually asking for the white-tailed deer, and since the white-tailed deer only eats plants, it's going to be considered a herbivore. Now, be careful, this was not asking for the raccoon. The raccoon would actually be considered an omnivore, because if you follow the lines that point to him, you can see that he eats plants as well as other consumers. So he's actually an omnivore. So if you didn't know that 9 was pointing to the white-tailed deer, make sure to make that correction that the white-tailed deer is a herbivore. And then finally, as we move up to our bobcat for number 8 eats only consumers. He eats the moorhen as well as the white-tailed deer, and so that makes him a carnivore. Now that we've got the diagram all filled in, take a minute to pause the video and answer questions 11, 12, and 13, and then when you're ready, unpause the video to check your answers. Go ahead and check your answers. For number 1, they're important because they break down organic material into smaller compounds so that they can be recycled and reused in the environment. Number 12 should be primary producers. And number 13, your answers may vary. I chose the Everglades crayfish for my example. If the Everglades crayfish was to suddenly become extinct, there would be less food for the frog and the raccoon, and so those populations would decline. And then the organisms that the crayfish eat may also increase in their population size because of the fact that there's one less organism eating them. Go ahead and turn your paper over. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to review the carbon cycle. With ecology, we have to remember that everything is being recycled. And so we're kind of connecting our unit on photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and all of those biogeochemical cycles to how all of the different organisms interact within an ecosystem, how they interact with their biotic factors, as well as things like the carbon cycle, which would be an abiotic factor. So the first thing is to take a look at the instructions at the top. We need to first label the different parts of this carbon cycle. So we're going to label the producers, the fossil fuels, rainwater, oceans, and geological activity. Take a minute, pause the video, do that, and then unpause the video to check your answers. All right, go ahead and double check your answers. Number 1, you should get geological activity. Number 2, rainwater. 3, oceans. 4, geological activity. 5, producers. And 6, fossil fuels. Go ahead and correct any mistakes you may have made. Next, take a minute to answer the following questions. Pause the video, and then you can unpause to check your answers. So for number 7, organisms that remove carbon from the atmosphere are going to be photosynthetic organisms that remove it during photosynthesis. Organisms that release carbon into the atmosphere are going to be all organisms release the carbon into the atmosphere during the process of cellular respiration. Number 8, how are fossil fuels made? Organic material gets turned into fossil fuels over millions of years through the process of decomposition, pressure, and heat. For number 9, how do geological activity contribute to the carbon cycle? Well, material gets transformed into carbon in marine sediments and carbonate rocks, and it also helps with creating fossil fuels. And then number 10, what happens to carbon in the body in an organ after it dies? And it's going to be decomposed and returned to the environment and recycled.